So we begin the Triduum, the 3 days, in which we remember especially at this time of year the Lord's final days. You're very lucky to be able to do it in a time of silence and retreat, and time for reflection. You probably will be reading over the accounts of the evangelists about the passion of the Lord, his death and burial and resurrection. You'll notice that 3 of the evangelists tell the story in about 2 pages of their gospel. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Very brief, rapid action ending in the burial of Jesus. But then if you turn to John, it takes him 5 chapters to tell you about the final days of Jesus. Not the final days, just the Last Supper. 5 chapters. What's going on? Well, you know that the first 3 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, wrote their Gospels at the end of the period when the eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry were dying out. So they wanted to get it down in writing. But John's Gospel comes probably as late as 120, almost 80 years after Jesus. And he knew that his people knew the details of the final days of Jesus. So he wasn't going to go over them in great detail. But it's interesting that he took the Last Supper and did give it great detail. And another thing about John's Gospel and the story of the Last Supper, which strikes a lot of people as very unusual, we always think of the Last Supper as the beginning of the Eucharistic celebration, the beginning of Christ's presence in the Blessed Sacrament, the bread and the wine offered to us for our growth in holiness and strength for Christian living. And all of that is true. But John does not mention bread or wine in his 5-chapter account of the Last Supper. Doesn't mention it at all. Now, I know he knew his congregation understood it. So what was he trying to do? I think he was trying to bring out the implications of the Eucharist. Because we can miss the point of the Eucharist. And sometimes we have, in the course of our history, missed the point, not by getting it wrong, but by not seeing enough of what the Eucharist means. We always were taught, we always think about Jesus is present in the Eucharist. He's in the bread and the wine of the sacrament. And we even go to pray in the presence of the sacrament after the Eucharistic celebration is over, where the hosts are reserved in the tabernacle to be taken to the sick. Very good practice. Practically one of the places anymore where you get some silence. That's what we always think about. But John reminds us, by not talking about the bread and wine of the Eucharist, what the Eucharist is all about really. This Jesus came into the world. We believe he is God, divine, become human, become one of us, in a very material world, and actually had a harder life than most of us have, and ended up as a public criminal and executed for that reason. But John is trying to remind us, by telling us about the washing of the feet, that the presence of Christ in the world is not merely Eucharistic in presence, it's personal. Jesus is not in retirement. He's not sitting next to the Father in heaven waiting for the Father's decision for him to come back. He's still in the world. He's in us. You are my disciples. My Spirit will be poured into you. You will possess my Spirit. He is still literally suffering in the world, in the person of all the people of the world who are suffering. He's in Syria. He's in Kenya. He's in the streets of our city. He's in our homes where we have lost loved ones or come down with an illness. Jesus has taken all the sufferings of humanity to himself and continues to bear that in himself to this very day, in us and through us and with us. And what John is trying to say here is the Eucharist is not something to be received. It is something to be done. If I, Jesus says, have given my total self for you, and I have made you my disciples, and I have given you my Spirit, then you must do what I did. You must turn yourself out for others. You must wash the feet of others. Now, in those days, that was a very practical thing to do. You went to somebody's house for dinner. If it was a poor person, they gave you a bowl of water and a towel to wash your own feet. But if it were a rich person, they would have one of their servants do it for you, the most menial task. And that's exactly what Jesus did. He washed the feet of his disciples, not of his equals, but of his students. And that's what he calls us to do. And that's what I think John is saying to us by not mentioning the bread and the wine of the Eucharist, because in a very certain sense, we are the bread and wine of the Eucharist in the world today. St. Augustine said, when you Christians come up the aisle to receive communion, when you come to receive the body of Christ, you are receiving what you are. You are the body of Christ, still present in this world, and to be as he was in the world of his own day. So as we enter into the Eucharist, into the Triduum, the first Eucharist really zeroes us in on what the coming of God among us is all about. God came among us to be one of us, and that means to suffer and die and be buried. And he asks us to go through that, to accept that, to live that out in the same way that he did. Not just at our death, but to die daily, as St. Paul says, by washing each other's feet, taking care of the needs of others, and doing it like Jesus did, starting with those closest to us and then rippling out to all the other people that God has placed in our sphere of influence. That's what Christian life is all about. And so this Mass this evening reminds us that we're not just on a memory trip. We're not just on an historical recollection of something that happened a long, long time ago, but we are personally involved in what is still happening today. The suffering and the death and the resurrection of a God who loved us so much that he became one of us and calls us to love each other so much that we become godly.